me ask you this. People often talk about paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
And a paradigm, in the kind of standard natural science version, is a fairly specific thing with
Yep.
some research methods, some theoretical concepts, experimental procedures. The kind of workshop that you're describing, I guess I'm kind of wondering, would you be willing to describe it as kind of articulating a paradigm, or is it more loosely interconnected?
Oh, well, I mean, I think you've actually forecast the answer to the question, because you can, in astronomy, you can build a new paradigm. There's already a sufficiently connected body of knowledge and procedures that you can say, all right, we're going to break with this view of how black holes operate, and we're going to substitute a new view. For reasons that we could talk about for days, the social sciences have never developed as connected a set of body of knowledge integrated with a set of procedures for verifying that knowledge. And the social sciences have remained a contested terrain. And that's something that people often try to articulate incorrectly from my point of view. We may disagree about this, but anyway, a common view is that the difference between the social sciences and the natural sciences is consciousness. That is to say, that the social scientists are intervening in processes with which they share consciousness. Well, I'm not so sympathetic to that point of view. I mean, it's true, but I don't think that that produces a fundamental difference in the situation of knowledge. Nevertheless, it does provide an opening for the moral and political concerns of the rest of the world to enter, that the relative bounding of much of physical science, natural science, makes more difficult. It doesn't make it impossible, obviously. Environmental warming is a case where there's the boundaries are porous, and there are a series of other issues. Biodiversity, there are a whole series of biological issues that are open to political contestation in some of the same ways. Nonetheless, the social sciences, by and large, all have one portion of their personnel that's primarily engaged in intervention. And they're engaged in intervention in at least two ways. One, by doing research on inequality in Dearborn or Detroit or something of that sort, intervention by speech, and so on. And so the social sciences remain a contested terrain, precisely open to new questions about the tyranny of the current administration, the possibility of ending war, the promotion of democracy, and so on. You can't enter these issues without touching on contested political and moral positions.
I wonder if you've ever been struck by the title that Herbert Simon used for one of his books, The Science of the Artificial.
Mm-hmm.
My thought is a way of distinguishing the social sciences from the natural sciences is that the architecture of the natural world is given, but the architecture of the social world is essentially created. We create states, we create institutions, not necessarily by deliberate design, but by the actions and interactions. And there's nothing that says the feudal state must have this structure. It's rather it has this structure because of a series of events that preceded, which led to a particular configuration of institutions. So the idea of the artificial versus the natural seems to me maybe a better way of distinguishing the social from the natural.
Well, I think there's a lot to that, although you're attributing less contingency to what Stephen Jay Gould, for example, talked about as the process of evolution than I would. I mean, in a Gouldian spirit, I would say there is a way in which organisms are creating unexpected patterns through their interaction. So let's not let's not exaggerate this. Nevertheless, it's true that humans are so far the most ingenious organisms we have in this regard, and human brains are instruments of enormous plasticity in the relations and arrangements that people create. So in that sense, there's a degree of difference, even though some forms of very interesting creativity go on in the natural sciences, and the more you move away from physics into the life sciences, the clearer that becomes.
You made a point to me a little earlier about war, that you don't think, or possibly it was revolution, you don't expect, you don't look for, you don't think it reasonable to imagine that there would be laws of war or laws of revolution, which does have to do with contingency.
It certainly does.
I wonder if you could amplify on that a little bit.
Well, there's a negative version of it and a positive version. The negative version runs, there are a lot of people who have thought they have discovered the law of, fill in the blank. And the blank is either a large structure or a large process. And we now have a pretty long experience of failure of that particular construction. So in that sense, I'm in sympathy with the sorts of people who look at rational choice and they say, well, wait a minute, it's a very interesting program, but let's look at the results. Let's see actually what the empirical accomplishments are. And the empirical accomplishments of looking for laws of large processes and structures, to my view, are close to nil.
Right.
Okay, so that's the negative case. The positive case is that it's implausible that the regularities operate at that level. That here I think you can cautiously draw on analogies with evolutionary change in the natural world and say, look, there are a few things we can say about diversity or about the complexity of environments and so forth, but the truth is that if we want to understand evolutionary processes, what we do is close in on how an organism or even a gene responds to its environment. Then we compound from that observation into how a species evolves and so forth. I mean, there are lots of analogies in medical analysis which are quite similar to this, where, you know, if you try to work on theories of the humors or something of this kind, as the ancients and not so ancients frequently did, where you have a law of the organism or something of the sort, you don't get very far. But when you can specify the mechanisms by which a disease moves from one organism to another or from one part of the body to another, you actually begin to be able to build up a more coherent and complex picture of what that process is. And I have a similar hope for social processes, not that I imagine that we have the kind of knowledge that the molecular biologists have at this point, but that the analogy will hold to the extent that if we can get interpersonal processes right, we can compound them into something like the pictures of structures and processes that people were trying to formulate laws for.
And this is the concept that I was explaining to you earlier about methodological localism.
Yeah,
Compounding up from the socially situated individual within a set of institutions.